Stop. Don't scroll past this video. What you're about to hear will shatter forever the myth of holy, pristine old Hollywood. We're used to seeing them as goddesses draped in silk and diamonds, paragons of purity and elegance. But behind the blinding flashes of the cameras lay a real den of vice. These 10 women turned their bedrooms into revolving doors, broke the hearts of the greatest men on the planet, destroyed families, and used sex as the only currency they had to buy a place at the top. And the final story, about the woman once called America's greatest virgin, will make your hair stand on end with horror and disgust. Watch to the end. The truth will crush you. But before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy. Marilyn Monroe. She was the ultimate fantasy of every man alive, yet in reality, she was passed around by nearly all of Hollywood, from sweat-soaked lighting technicians on set to the President of the United States himself. Marilyn Monroe, a golden goddess with a blinding smile the entire country longed to hold, and studio bosses were eager to use and discard. What you're about to learn will never appear in glossy biographies. Her road to fame didn't begin in audition halls, but on smoke-stained couches in casting offices and in the back seats of producers' luxury cars. Marilyn changed lovers at such a terrifying pace that her personal secretaries couldn't keep up with the new names in her address book. For her, sex wasn't an act of love. It was the only tool she had to survive in a world that treated women like cuts of meat. Norma Jean, reborn as Marilyn, understood the rules of the game all too well. At the very start of her career, she endured what was known as the casting couch with every second power broker in the industry. It was said that at Fox, there wasn't a single top executive who hadn't tasted the future icon. She was convenient, compliant, and desperate for validation. Her official marriages, to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio and intellectual Arthur Miller, were nothing more than pitiful attempts to build a facade of normalcy. Behind those pretty magazine covers hid an endless churning conveyor belt of random actors, directors, and photographers. DiMaggio was driven mad by jealousy, and he had every reason to be. He knew every man desired his wife, and worse still, she didn't always say no. The real hell began when Marilyn drifted into the orbit of America's most powerful family, the Kennedy clan. This was the peak of her downfall. She became a toy for 2 brothers at once, the President, John F. Kennedy, and the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. She was passed from one to the other like an expensive accessory. When the President grew bored, he sent her to his brother. Marilyn, dulled by alcohol and pills, believed she would become First Lady, but to the Kennedys, she was nothing more than a dangerous witness to their filthy secrets, a public plaything whose presence was meant to be temporary. She sought protection in their arms and instead became target number 1 for intelligence agencies that recorded every moan and every phone call. Her sexual appetite, fueled by chronic insecurity, became a legend whispered about in every Los Angeles bar. Frank Sinatra, Yves Montand, Marlon Brando, the list of her conquests read like the credits of the most expensive film ever made. She searched for a father she never had, and found only men who wanted to bask in the glow of her fame or tick another box on their list. She became the industry's most used mattress, not because she was depraved, but because she was broken. Hollywood drained the life from her frame by frame, night after night. She gave herself away in pieces to anyone who promised a drop of warmth, and was left with nothing but piles of empty champagne bottles and packets of barbiturates. When Marilyn stopped being profitable, when her lateness and breakdowns became too costly for the studios, she was simply written off. The same men who had sworn eternal love on crumpled sheets were the first to turn their backs. On the last night of her life, she frantically dialed the numbers of her former protectors, but no one answered. The goddess everyone had used was needed by no one. She was found dead in an empty bedroom,
a phone receiver clutched in her hand, a symbol of absolute loneliness in a world where her body belonged to millions and her soul to no one. She became a victim of the system she herself fed with her beauty, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste of disillusionment and a myth she paid for at the highest possible price.
Joan Crawford. If there was ever a figure in the history of old Hollywood willing, quite literally, to go to any lengths for a coveted role or an extra moment of screen time, it was Joan Crawford. She was hailed as a steel magnolia and a style icon, yet behind the blinding glare of the spotlights lurked a ruthless sexual predator whose appetites unsettled even the industry's most notorious libertines. What unfolded behind the closed doors of her mansion sounded less like the life of a top-tier star and more like a lurid screenplay. Joan did not simply change lovers, she amassed them, treating men as expendable resources in the construction of her career. Colleagues, whispering with barely concealed spite, claimed that Crawford considered it a professional ritual to sleep with every co-star, merely to establish chemistry. Her ascent was paved not only with talent, but with the bodies of those who controlled the studios. Back in the silent era, Lucille Lesueur, the actress's real name, grasped an unspoken rule. In this city, survival favored those who knew how to sell desire. She began in questionable dance reviews and, according to persistent rumors, even appeared in adult films that MGM later frantically bought up and destroyed to protect their star's image. Yet the past could never be erased completely. Joan was obsessed with power over men. Her 4 official marriages were little more than set dressing, a respectable facade concealing a life steeped in betrayal and excess. The list of her conquests read like a Hollywood who's who: Clark Gable, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Franchot Tone. She drew the era's greatest leading men into her orbit, yet never limited herself to them. Crawford turned up her nose at no one: young extras, director's assistants, chance admirers, even, as malicious tongues insisted, her own drivers. She was insatiable. One contemporary recalled, "Joan needed sex as much as air. She could halt a rehearsal, drag a man she fancied into her dressing room, and return 10 minutes later as if nothing had happened. She knew no shame and accepted no refusal. If Crawford wanted a man, she took him, by whatever means necessary." Behind this frenzy, however, lay an icy surgical calculation. Every affair was a strategic move. She chose the right men at the right moments, using them as stepping stones and discarding them the instant a contract was signed or a role secured. They called her a man-eater, and it was no exaggeration. She drained her partners of energy, money, and connections, leaving behind little more than hollowed-out lives. Her habit of dragging along an entourage of lovers became legendary. At every party, a train of past and future victims followed in her wake, gazing at her with a mixture of awe and dread. Joan inspired particular hatred among other women. Her feud with Bette Davis became infamous, yet few knew that its true cause lay not only in roles, but in men Joan stole right from under her rivals' noses. She took a cruel pleasure in wrecking marriages and watching the anguish of her lovers' wives. Moral boundaries did not exist for her. Hollywood liked to joke that Joan Crawford was the only woman capable of sleeping with the devil and making him pay alimony. Retribution, however, was inevitable and merciless. With age, when makeup could no longer hide the lines and alcohol became her constant companion, Joan turned into a caricature of herself. Her fanatical obsession with cleanliness and order, later exposed by her daughter Christina Crawford in the scandalous memoir Mommy Dearest, was little more than an attempt to scrub away the grime of decades of reckless excess.
She became a tyrant who terrorized her own children, pouring onto them all the bitterness she felt toward fading youth and vanishing lovers. In her final years, Joan Crawford shut herself away in her apartment, surrounded only by ghosts of the past and bottles of vodka. The men who once crowded her doorway had long forgotten the path to it. The woman who once dragged all of Hollywood in her wake found herself utterly alone. She died in isolation, leaving behind piles of absurd hats, yellowed posters, and the reputation of a woman who traded body and soul for the glitter of fool's gold. It was the end of a great predator who never understood that in bed with Hollywood, Hollywood is always the one who wins.
Hollywood's Cleopatra, the woman with the rare violet eyes and a double row of eyelashes who was physically incapable of spending even a single night alone. Elizabeth Taylor. To the world, she embodied untouchable luxury. Behind the scenes, Hollywood saw her as a black widow who changed husbands more often than her legendary diamonds. 8 official marriages and hundreds of affairs that kept the global press buzzing for decades. Taylor didn't merely drag an army of lovers behind her. She tore men out of their families with such cold-blooded precision that at one point all of America seemed to curse her, and respectable housewives crossed the street when they saw her photograph. Her appetites knew no limits, and her sense of ownership was absolute. If Elizabeth set her sights on a man, he was meant to belong to her here and now, even if a wedding ring sat on his finger and children were waiting at home. The loudest scandal in Hollywood history erupted when Taylor decided she wanted singer Eddie Fisher. The problem was that Eddie was married to her best friend, America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds. The country was stunned. Taylor had sobbed on Debbie's shoulder after the death of her previous husband, Mike Todd, and only weeks later she was caught in bed with that same friend's husband. When the press cornered her, Elizabeth delivered the line that became the motto of her life. "What, do you expect me to sleep alone?" She didn't care about her reputation. She needed a man, now, immediately, at any cost. But this was only the beginning of her ruthless march across male hearts. The filming of Cleopatra became not just the most expensive disaster in studio history, but the battlefield of the most infamous affair of the 20th century. Elizabeth met Richard Burton. Both were married, but that had never been an obstacle for Taylor. Their relationship resembled a prolonged drunken brawl, punctuated by frenzied sex and mutual betrayals. They dragged each other across the globe, burning millions on alcohol and jewels, while their official spouses went mad with humiliation. Taylor married Burton twice, and both times their life together turned into a private hell of jealousy and booze. She was incapable of loving calmly. She needed drama, shattered plates, and new lovers to keep the old ones interested. The list of her men looked like a first-class passenger manifest on a transatlantic liner. Billionaires, politicians, actors, she used each of them as a donor shot of attention. Colleagues claimed Taylor could derail a multi-million-dollar production if her latest favorite didn't give her enough time in the bedroom. She lived at full throttle, indifferent to the feelings of those whose lives and careers she reduced to rubble. Behind her violet gaze hid the iron will of a master manipulator. She knew no man could resist her beauty and used it like a legal narcotic. She dragged her husbands along like accessories, choosing them to match a new dress or a shifting mood. Nature and excess eventually took their toll. By 40, Taylor had begun to turn into a caricature of herself. Endless cycles of starvation diets and binge eating, alcoholism, and dependence on painkillers transformed the goddess into a capricious, chronically ill woman. Her later marriages, like the one to construction worker Larry Fortensky, whom she met in a rehabilitation clinic, evoked only queasy pity in Hollywood. The woman who had slept with the kings of the industry now shared a bed with a laborer simply so the light in her bedroom wouldn't go out. Elizabeth Taylor ended her journey in a wheelchair, draped in diamonds worth the budget of a small country, and locked in an absolute emotional vacuum. Her body was ravaged by dozens of surgeries, her memory crowded with the faces of men whose names she could no longer recall. She possessed all the treasures in the world. She had pulled the very best into her bed, yet never managed to fill the black hole of loneliness that had yawned inside her since childhood. She remains in history as a great actress, but above all as a supreme egoist, for whom love was merely the excuse for the next scandalous headline and another 30-carat ring. It was the final act of a woman who wanted to own everyone, and in the end belonged to no one.
Lana Turner. If Marilyn was a victim and Crawford a predator, then Lana Turner was Hollywood's true curse. On screen, she embodied purity, innocence, and girlish charm, earning the nickname the Sweater Girl. Yet behind that angelic facade lived a woman whose private life resembled a crime blotter from the murders and investigations section. 7 official husbands, a lover list as endless as a freight train, and relationships that ultimately led to real bloodshed. Lana did not merely change men like gloves. She attracted danger, filth, and violence, turning every bedroom she entered into a combat zone. Her appetite for bad boys was legendary and destructive. While MGM tried to mold her into the image of the wholesome girl next door, Lana dragged the most notorious scum of Los Angeles into her bed. Frank Sinatra, Clark Gable, Tyrone Power, they were merely decorative flowers in her bouquet. The real poison was her affair with Johnny Stompanato, the bodyguard and errand boy of infamous mobster Mickey Cohen. Lana knew he was a criminal. She knew he lived off her money, but she was drawn to violence. Their relationship was a cycle of drunken rampages, beatings, and savage passion. Stompanato beat her so brutally that makeup artists spent hours concealing bruises on the face of Hollywood's #1 star just so she could step in front of the camera. The tragedy that stunned the world unfolded in 1958. Lana once again tried to leave her gangster lover, and during a vicious, blood-soaked argument in the bedroom, her 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, burst in. Defending her mother, the girl plunged a kitchen knife straight into Stompanato's stomach. He died on the spot, collapsing in a pool of his own blood. Hollywood froze in collective shock. It seemed like the end, but Lana Turner turned the trial into the greatest performance of her life. She wept on the witness stand with a conviction she had rarely achieved on screen. Her daughter was acquitted, the act ruled self-defense, and Lana found herself a new man within months. A death in her own bedroom became nothing more than fuel for another surge of publicity. Colleagues recalled that Lana Turner never knew how to be alone. The moment one man walked out the door, she dragged another one in. All of Hollywood dragged her around, but she, in turn, dragged behind her a trail of ruined lives. One of her husbands, millionaire Bob Topping, went bankrupt trying to satisfy her appetites. Another, the handsome Lex Barker, found himself at the center of a scandal when Lana's daughter accused him of sexual abuse. Lana lived in chaos of her own making. She changed men not for love, but for the rush delivered by alcohol, sex, and danger. Obsessed with attention, she freely used her looks to survive in a world that considered her talent mediocre. Her reputation became so toxic that serious directors were afraid to work with her, fearing another murder or a mafia-related scandal. But Lana kept hunting. Her list ran into hundreds, from random bartenders to the era's biggest stars. She lived on borrowed time, financially and morally. People said she could spend a night with a stranger just to prove to herself that she was still the real Lana. She became the embodiment of Hollywood's decay, dazzling on the outside, utterly hollow and burned out within. A woman who never learned the meaning of the word stop. Lana Turner's ending was predictably bleak. By the end of her life, ravaged by cancer and decades of abuse of everything imaginable, she was left completely alone. 7 marriages brought her neither warmth nor protection. Her daughter, who had become an unwilling killer in her mother's defense, could never fully forgive the nightmare Lana had made of their lives. the screen goddess whose photographs once hung above soldiers' bunks during the Second World War, spent her final days remembering not roles, but the shadows of men who had passed through her bed and vanished forever. History remembers her not as a great actress, but as a woman whose black list of lovers was written in blood.
Ingrid Bergman. The whole world believed she was an angel descended from heaven. After Casablanca and For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ingrid Bergman became a symbol of innocence, purity, and exalted femininity for millions. They called her Saint Ingrid. But what this Swedish goddess did in 1949 made America recoil in disgust and drove senators to curse her name from the floor of Congress. Bergman committed what Puritan Hollywood considered a mortal sin. She tore off the mask of holiness and showed the world the face of a woman who changed men and lives as easily as gloves on a film set. Married to a respectable Swedish doctor, Petter Lindström, raising a daughter and enjoying a reputation as an impeccable lady, Ingrid suddenly caught fire for another man. He was the Italian director Roberto Rossellini. She wrote to him herself, a letter thick with barely veiled desire, and traveled to Italy under the pretense of work. The work quickly moved into the bedroom. Bergman abandoned everything, her husband, her child, her career, and the adoration of a nation for a wild, reckless affair played out before the eyes of the entire world. When it emerged that Saint Ingrid was pregnant by the Italian while still married, America erupted. She was branded an agent of the devil, a loose woman, and calls rang out for a total boycott of her films. Those who knew Bergman behind the scenes understood that Italy was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the image of a cool northern beauty lived a woman with a destructive passion. Ingrid could not exist without being in love. Once the fire in the bed dimmed, she went searching for new fuel. Before Rossellini, gossip and rumor dragged her name through alleged affairs with photographer Robert Capa and director Victor Fleming. She tangled with co-stars, leaving behind a wake of broken hearts and ruined reputations. On screen, she played nuns and Saint Joan of Arc. In life, she followed instincts she never tried to restrain. Her affair with Rossellini was like a volcanic eruption, violent, messy, and public. They hauled each other through newspaper headlines while their lawful spouses struggled to preserve what little dignity they had left. Ingrid bore Roberto 3 children, yet even this so-called union made in heaven could not hold her. As soon as the passion cooled, Bergman began to look elsewhere. She proved to Hollywood that even the most spiritual face can hide a woman for whom the family hearth is nothing more than a brief stopover before the next leap into another bed. America did not forgive her betrayal for 7 long years. Bergman was exiled from Hollywood, her name smeared with filth. But she returned, proud, distant, and just as perpetually in love. She married for a 3rd time to theater producer Lars Schmidt, yet this marriage, too, failed to save her from the endless search for the one man. Colleagues recalled that Ingrid possessed a remarkable gift. She could sincerely believe in her own purity even as she stepped out of another lover's bedroom. She was a collector of emotions, for whom men were merely material for her great performance. The end of Ingrid Bergman's life carried a tragic grandeur. She battled breast cancer for 9 years, continuing to act and fall in love until her final breath. She died on her 67th birthday, leaving behind 3 Oscars and hundreds of scandalous headlines. The woman once denounced as an agent of the devil departed as a great actress. But those whose families she shattered and the men she left behind for a new spark remembered a different Ingrid, a woman with an icy gaze and a ravenous heart, who traded sainthood for an endless procession of lovers. She proved one thing beyond doubt. In Hollywood, angels do not live. They only pretend to be them when the camera is rolling. Hedy Lamarr. Brace yourself, because the story of this woman is not merely a catalog of affairs. It is a chronicle of how dazzling beauty and a brilliant mind can become a one-way ticket to a private hell. Hedy Lamarr, the woman whom Louis B. Mayer himself called the most beautiful woman in the world. She became the visual blueprint for Snow White and Catwoman alike, yet behind that flawless face lived a volcano that erupted in Hollywood bedrooms for decades. 6 official marriages and countless romances followed. Hedy dragged men along like trophies taken by a hunter, only to discover time and again that they adored her face but feared her mind. Her path to the title of Hollywood's greatest sinner began with a scandal that may seem tame today, but in 1933 shook Europe to its core. In the film Ecstasy, Hedy appeared nude and shocked audiences with an unprecedented level of intimacy on screen. The Pope condemned her, Hitler banned the film, and her first husband, Austrian arms magnate Fritz Mondel, tried to buy and destroy every copy so no one would ever see his wife that way. He kept her confined in his castle like a prisoner, but Hedy was not made to submit. She escaped to Hollywood, reportedly slipping away by drugging a maid and fleeing in her clothes. She broke free and plunged headlong into excess, turning her life into an endless audition of lovers. In Hollywood, Hedy Lamarr became an exotic ornament, while her private life resembled a revolving door. Men came and went with alarming speed: tycoons, actors, studio technicians. Her official husbands were only the visible tip of a much larger story. Screenwriters, producers, oil barons. Hedy searched them for rescue from boredom and loneliness, but found only disappointment. Colleagues whispered that her desires were boundless and her temperament unbearable. She knew she was smarter than the men around her. After all, it was Hedy who co-invented a communication system that would later form the basis of modern Wi-Fi. Yet none of that brilliance mattered in her relationships. In private, men wanted a silent beauty, not a thinking woman. Her romances with Charlie Chaplin, Billy Wilder, and even John F. Kennedy were the talk of the town. Hedy could not endure solitude. The moment one marriage ended, she rushed into the arms of the next supposed savior. But as she aged, Hollywood slowly turned away. To the industry, she became nothing more than an aging commodity. Desperate to hold on to men and slipping youth, Hedy took drastic measures. She became one of the earliest casualties of plastic surgery, repeatedly reshaping her face in a futile attempt to reclaim the Snow White the world once worshipped. The final act of this goddess's life was genuinely tragic. By the 1970s, Hedy Lamarr had withdrawn from the world. She was accused of shoplifting, stealing inexpensive cosmetics despite having millions in the bank. It was a cry for attention from a woman once carried in the world's arms and now ignored by all. She locked herself inside her Florida apartment, speaking to the outside world only by telephone, sometimes staying on the line for 7 hours at a time. She did not want anyone to see what had become of her once perfect face. The hundreds of men who once knelt at her feet were long gone. Hedy Lamarr died alone in 2000, leaving behind a world that still uses her inventions and the memory of a woman too beautiful to be loved and too intelligent to ever find peace in someone else's arms.
Lauren Bacall. She was one half of the most sacred couple of the Golden Age, Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart, slim and bogey. Their love was held up as the gold standard of fidelity in a rotten town, but no sooner had the great Bogart cooled in his grave than his grieving widow tore off her veil of mourning and launched into such a frantic dance across other people's beds that Hollywood could only stare in disbelief. Bacall had no intention of spending the rest of her days crying over faded posters. She was young, predatory, and possessed that low, husky voice that made men's knees buckle. She didn't just change lovers. She tried to pull into her bedroom everyone who had once surrounded her late husband, as if hoping to fill the void with familiar names. The first man to fall into her trap was none other than Frank Sinatra, Bogart's closest friend. Hollywood was stunned. Only a few months had passed since the funeral, and inconsolable Lauren was already enjoying herself with America's most notorious womanizer. Sinatra dragged her through private clubs and casinos, while she was already trying on the role of the next Mrs. Sinatra. Lauren was obsessed with the idea of becoming the wife of another king, but Frank quickly realized this woman was too controlling, too demanding, too tight around the throat. When she tried to force him into marriage through the press, Sinatra simply erased her from his life without a word. Bacall was humiliated in full public view, but it didn't stop her. The hunt went on. Her list of lovers grew like a wildfire. She pulled Jason Robards along with her, an actor crippled by severe alcoholism, hoping he might become a second bogey. But Robards wasn't bogey. He was a brawler, and their marriage turned into an endless cycle of scandals, affairs, and drunken breakdowns. Lauren neither knew how nor wanted to be just a wife. She needed to dominate. She needed to be desired the way she had been the first time she leaned against that doorway into have and have not. She changed men, searching for shadows of the past, and found only disappointment and emptiness. Colleagues from the theater world recalled that Bacall's character grew genuinely unbearable with time. She considered herself Hollywood aristocracy and treated men like servants. Her affairs with younger actors and powerful producers were brief and poisonous. She destroyed relationships as quickly as she created them, leaving scorched earth behind. Bacall was a master of cold contempt. When a man stopped serving her needs, she erased him from her memory as if he had never existed. She carried her status as the widow of a legend like a shield, but behind it stood a woman who never learned how to be happy alone. She lived a long life, keeping her signature stare and sharp tongue to the very end. Yet in the quiet corridors of the theater world, everyone knew Bacall was profoundly lonely. The great men she collected either fled from her steel-hard nature or died. She remained the last of the Mohicans, a keeper of Golden Age secrets, but her own life became a kaleidoscope of random faces and failed unions. She gained fame, she gained recognition, but the slim who once gazed so devotedly at Bogart vanished, replaced by a cold collector of men's hearts. Lauren Bacall's finale was a luxurious apartment in the Dakota, crammed with antiques and ghosts. She died at 89, a legend, but those who had seen her without the mask remembered a woman who tried so desperately to outrun the shadow of her great husband that she ultimately lost herself in an endless procession of other people's bedrooms. She proved one thing beyond doubt: you can be an icon of devotion on screen, but in life, Hollywood always forces you to play by its own dirty rules.
Marlene Dietrich. Prepare yourself, because this is the story of a woman for whom the very ideas of morality and fidelity meant nothing at all. Hollywood's Blue Angel, Marlene Dietrich. She did not merely change lovers, she kept meticulous records of them, like an accountant working in hell. Officially, she was married to Rudolf Sieber for more than 50 years, yet that never stopped her from turning her life into the most vast and depraved conveyor belt of passion the Golden Age had ever seen. She slept with the greatest minds, the most beautiful men, and, most shocking of all to puritanical America, with the most dangerous women of her era. Marlene recognized no boundaries, no gender, and no shame. Her husband Rudolph lived in Europe with his mistress, while Dietrich dragged the elite of Hollywood through her beds. Most astonishing of all, husband and wife corresponded regularly, calmly discussing her latest conquests. She collected people as trophies. Her list included Erich Maria Remarque, Jean Gabin, Ernest Hemingway, Gary Cooper, and Yul Brynner. Dietrich was a master of psychological manipulation. She did not simply sleep with men, she enslaved them. She could arrive at a lover's home, scrub his floors, cook him dinner, and reduce geniuses to tears at her feet, only to coldly dismiss them the next day in favor of a new victim. Her appetites, however, did not stop with men.
Hollywood whispered about the so-called sewing circle, a clandestine network of bisexual actresses in which Dietrich reigned as the uncrowned queen. She conducted affairs with Greta Garbo, Edith Piaf, and many other divas, reveling in her power over both sexes. For Marlene, love was a tool of domination. She dragged lovers of every kind behind her like accessories, selecting them to match her mood or the color of her costume. Her hunger for adoration was insatiable, and each new conquest was merely proof to herself that she remained eternally young. Colleagues recalled that Dietrich possessed virtually no empathy. When the great writer Remarque sent her letters overflowing with pain and devotion, she read them aloud to her new lovers, mocking his emotions. She drained people of talent, inspiration, and vitality, leaving scorched souls in her wake. Gabin, who loved her madly, eventually fled, unable to endure her endless infidelities and icy calculation. Marlene never belonged to anyone else. She belonged only to her own myth, which she fed with the fresh blood of new affairs. Time, however, was the one enemy Dietrich could not drag into her bed. By 70, she was gripped by a terror of aging. She taped her face tight beneath her wigs to hide wrinkles and wore suffocating corsets that sometimes made her faint. When concealment became impossible, she made the most radical decision of her life. She vanished. For the final 12 years of her life, Marlene remained confined to her Paris apartment, rarely leaving her bed. She allowed no visitors, not even her own daughter, determined that the world remember her as the Blue Angel rather than a frail old woman. Marlene Dietrich's finale was a voluntary imprisonment within 4 walls steeped in the smell of whiskey, cheap cigarettes, and dusty posters. She communicated with the world only by telephone, continuing to perform the role of the fatal woman for an invisible audience. The hundreds of men and women she once dragged behind her were long gone. She died in 1992, completely alone, a casualty of her own cult. She proved one final truth: it is possible to possess every body in Hollywood and still end up alone in an empty room, facing a shattered mirror that no longer agrees to lie.
Greta Garbo. She was the most enigmatic woman in the history of world cinema, the Snow Queen, the Swedish Sphinx, the woman whose motto became the line, "I want to be left alone." But behind that mask of icy solitude and self-imposed exile hid a truth that would have made respectable citizens of her era grow dizzy with shock. Greta Garbo didn't simply want peace. She wanted no one to see how she changed lovers, both men and women, at a frightening speed, living a double life deep in the shadows of the Hollywood hills. Her reclusiveness was the perfect camouflage for the violent passions she carried from one secret bedroom to another. The world believed in her coldness, but behind the gates of MGM they knew better. Garbo was fire, and anyone who dared come too close was burned. She changed men with a cold, almost surgical precision. Her first great trophy was actor John Gilbert. He was so obsessed with her that he proposed 3 times, and 3 times she abandoned him on the eve of the wedding, simply because she grew bored. She dragged him along like a tame dog, shattered his career and his psyche, and when he ceased to interest her, she stepped over him without a backward glance. Garbo never belonged to men. She used them as fuel for her mystique, feeding the furnace one after another. But the real shock lay beyond the male list. Garbo was a central figure in Hollywood's secret forbidden circles. Her affairs with women, actresses, screenwriters, society figures, were so numerous they were barely kept from the press. Poet Mercedes d'Acosta followed her like a faithful shadow for decades, yet Garbo treated her like a rag, pulling her close one moment and throwing her out of her life the next whenever demands grew too loud. She left a trail of broken hearts of both sexes, savoring her own elusiveness. Garbo was a master of disguise. She used male aliases, wore men's clothing, and arranged meetings in abandoned mansions so no one would uncover the truth about her unconventional hungers. Her male lovers included some of the most powerful figures of the era: conductor Leopold Stokowski, millionaire Georges Schlee, photographer Cecil Beaton. She played cat and mouse with them, making them wait months for a single glance, then vanishing for half a year without answering letters. Beaton, who was practically ill with love for her, spent decades trying to win her hand, only for Garbo to laugh in his face. She neither knew how nor wished to be faithful. Every new person was merely a brief episode to be lived through and discarded. She was a collector of souls, feeding her screen grandeur with the real suffering of those who fell in love with her. When Garbo abruptly walked away from cinema at 36, Hollywood decided she had lost her mind. In truth, it was just another move in her game. She spent the next 50 years in New York, wandering the streets in oversized glasses and a hat pulled low over her brow, continuing her secret life far from prying eyes. She brought her hidden lovers into her luxurious Manhattan apartment, and none of the neighbors suspected that behind those walls unfolded an endless carousel of affairs. She became a ghost, but a deeply physical one. The end of the Swedish Sphinx was as cold as her image. She died in 1990, leaving behind a fortune worth tens of millions and an absolute void where her personal life should have been. Those she once loved or used either drank themselves to ruin, died in poverty, or were erased from her memory long before her death. She proved that you can deceive the entire world into believing in your solitude while changing lovers behind closed curtains. She left without ever lifting the veil, leaving only the myth of a great recluse who was, in truth, one of the most insatiable women in Hollywood history.
Judy Garland. Now prepare yourself for the darkest and most painful story on our list. Little Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, America's eternal innocent, the nation's symbol of purity, Judy Garland. The world saw an angelic child with a heavenly voice, but behind the gates of MGM her life was turned into a living nightmare. Studio executives passed her from hand to hand, fed her pills, controlled her body, her sleep, her appetite, and even her sense of self, forcing her to grow up in a system that first shattered her psyche and then abandoned her without mercy. What follows strips the rainbow from the myth forever. Judy was not reckless by nature. She was shaped that way by an industry that broke her and then sold the pieces. It began when Judy was still a teenager. Studio bosses, including the tyrannical Louis B. Mayer, saw her as an ugly duckling next to glamorous stars like Lana Turner. To keep her working 20-hour days, she was placed on stimulants as early as 13. To make her sleep, she was given powerful sedatives. This chemical leash robbed her of agency for the rest of her life. Judy was ushered from office to office where powerful men demanded gratitude for opportunities she never truly chose. She grew up believing she was unattractive and that the only way to earn affection was to give herself away. 5 official marriages and countless destructive relationships were not indulgence, but the desperate grasping of a drowning woman for warmth and safety. Her first husband, musician David Rose, married her when she was barely 19. Under studio pressure, he forced her to end a pregnancy so as not to damage the carefully maintained image of a teenage girl. Something inside her fractured beyond repair. From that moment on, Judy spiraled. She sought closeness not out of desire, but from a crushing, relentless loneliness. She married director Vincente Minnelli and gave birth to Liza, but their union was a facade. Minnelli concealed his true self, while Judy continued searching for comfort in the arms of men who promised rescue and delivered only deeper despair. Her relationships with Frank Sinatra and Sid Luft were consumed by chaos, addiction, and emotional collapse. She lived in constant extremes, clinging fiercely, unraveling publicly, and exhausting everyone around her. Studios sent her to clinics hoping to stabilize their investment, but each release only restarted the cycle. Pills, alcohol, and an endless parade of faces offering temporary escape. Judy Garland became Hollywood's most dangerous paradox, a legendary talent no one wanted to hire because no one knew which version of her would appear on set. By 40, Judy Garland looked and felt decades older. Her final marriages horrified the public. Her fifth husband, Mickey Deans, much younger than she was, effectively became her keeper, dragging the fading star through obscure London clubs and exhausting performances to fund their shared dependencies. Judy no longer knew where she was or who stood beside her. The girl who once sang about a yellow brick road now drifted through anonymous rooms, exhausted, confused, and starved for affection. She gave Hollywood everything, her youth, her voice, her body, and the industry consumed and discarded what remained. Judy Garland's ending was the bleakest note in this symphony of ruin. She was found dead in a rented London home in 1969. She was only 47 years old, though she looked far older. Thousands mourned her publicly, yet in her final days none of the men who had passed through her life were there. She left behind overwhelming debt and children burdened with grief. This was the end of a woman the world had crowned a saint and whom Hollywood transformed into its most tragic sacrifice.
10 names, 10 goddesses whose faces are carved into the granite of world cinema history. But now, with the masks torn away and the studio lights extinguished, what remains of that dazzling image? We no longer see holy icons, but women of flesh and blood, thrown into the furnace of the most merciless conveyor belt ever built. Golden Age Hollywood was not a fairy tale about love. It was a colossal, alcohol-soaked den of lust, where every frame, every roll, every diamond had to be paid for with the most expensive currency of all, one's body and one's soul. These 10 actresses dragged behind them trails of hundreds of lovers, but look at how each of their stories ended. Loneliness, poverty, abandoned apartments, psychiatric clinics, empty bottles of barbiturates. The system turned their sexuality into a commodity, squeezed them dry to the last drop, and tossed them aside the moment a younger, fresher face appeared on the horizon. They changed men like gloves, desperately trying to buy themselves safety, or at least the illusion that someone loved them not for their screen image, but for who they truly were. But in this city of illusions, love always lost to calculation. Today they are called legends. Monuments are erected in their honor. Retrospectives are devoted to their work. Yet no one remembers the shattered families, the abandoned children, the broken men whose lives were ground down in the beds of these divas. We admire their grace, forgetting that behind every languid glance hid either the cold grip of a predator or the silent scream of a victim. It was an era of great cinema and great sin, where morality was cheaper than a ticket to the front row. The truth we have uncovered today may provoke disgust or deep pity, but one thing is certain: the golden glow of that Hollywood has faded forever. Beneath Dior silk and mink fur lay bruises, filth, and a wringing, endless loneliness. They wanted to possess the entire world, yet in the end they could not even hold on to themselves. And now it's time to ask you, was the price worth it? Is global fame and eternal remembrance worth turning your life into a revolving door and dying alone in an empty room, forgotten by everyone you once led into your bed? Or perhaps this is the true tragedy of beauty, to be needed by everyone, yet to belong to no one. Write your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and believe us, the arguments there burn hotter than the lights on a Hollywood soundstage. Whose fate seems the most unjust to you, and who among them was truly unfit for a normal human life? Don't forget to hit like if you're just as shocked by what went on behind the scenes of your favorite films.
Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, because in the next episode, we'll be shaking the skeletons out of the closets of those you believed were perfect family men. You'll be begging for it to be untrue. See you in the next episode of The Dirtiest History of Cinema.